It was a late night in the middle of nowhere. Jay had just finished a long shift at work, his body aching from exhaustion, and he had to drive through a rural road to get back home. The road was notorious for being poorly lit, with sharp curves and dense forests flanking both sides. But tonight, something felt different. There was a heavy fog that clung to the air, making the already narrow road seem even more suffocating. The mist was so dense that it felt like a living entity, wrapping itself around everything in its path. The car's headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the winding road ahead, but the darkness seemed to swallow up everything beyond. It was as if the fog was a curtain, hiding whatever lay ahead, making each turn a mystery. Jay fiddled with the radio to distract himself, but all he could find were static and faint signals from distant stations. The crackling noise only added to the eerie atmosphere, making him feel even more isolated. Giving up, he sighed, turning the radio off and gripping the steering wheel tighter. His knuckles turned white as he tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept wandering. As he drove further into the fog, the oppressive silence began to weigh on him. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The road was deserted. No other cars, no lights from nearby houses, just an endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. It felt like he was the only person left in the world, driving through an endless void. He felt a strange unease creeping up his spine, but he shrugged it off. The feeling was persistent, though, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. It was just the late hour, the isolation, and the exhaustion, he thought. Nothing more. Yet, the fog seemed to whisper secrets, and the darkness felt alive, making him question his own sanity. But then, in the corner of his eye, something shifted. A dark figure standing by the side of the road. It was gone in a blink, disappearing into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. Jay's heart skipped a beat, his hands tightening on the wheel. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the fog, or a stray animal. But as he continued driving, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few minutes later, his rearview mirror caught a glimpse of something unusual. At first, he thought it was just the fog reflecting in the mirror, but there was something more. A shadow that hadn't been there before. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Jay glanced up at the mirror. His blood turned to ice. There, in the back seat, was a woman. She appeared out of nowhere, as if she had materialized from the shadows themselves. Her face was half hidden in shadow, but what he could see made his skin crawl. The dim light from the dashboard cast eerie shadows, accentuating her already terrifying appearance. Her hair hung in matted clumps, wet and tangled, and her clothes were tattered and stained. It looked as though she had been through a storm, or worse, something far more sinister. But it was her face, what was left of it, that nearly made him slam on the brakes. The horror of her visage was almost too much to bear. The skin on one side was torn away, exposing raw muscle and bone, while the other side was grotesquely swollen and bruised. It was as if she had been in a terrible accident, or worse, a victim of some unspeakable violence. One eye stared lifelessly forward, while the other seemed sunken deep into its socket. The lifeless eye seemed to pierce through him, while the sunken one added to her ghastly appearance. Jay's heart pounded in his chest, and he forced himself to stay calm. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, making his hands shake even more. Maybe he was hallucinating, he told himself. It had been a long day, and his mind could be playing tricks on him. The exhaustion, the fog, the stress, they could all play tricks on the mind. He had been driving for hours, and the road seemed endless. He blinked hard, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and glanced back at the mirror. She was still there. The sight of her made his stomach churn, and this time, she was smiling. A smile that was devoid of any warmth or humanity. A slow, twisted grin stretched across her mangled face, revealing broken, jagged teeth. Jay's breath hitched. The sight of those teeth sent a shiver down his spine. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. He had to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing. How had she gotten into his car? He replayed the events of the night in his mind, searching for any clue. He hadn't stopped, hadn't picked anyone up. He was certain of it. The memory of the empty road was clear in his mind. The doors were locked, weren't they? He had made sure of it when he started his journey, but the more he thought about it, the more the dread seeped into his bones. The realization that she was there, despite all logic, was terrifying. Without thinking, Jay swerved the car to the side of the road, his tires screeching against the wet pavement. The sound echoed in the night, adding to the surreal atmosphere. He threw the car into park, fumbling with the seatbelt, his hands trembling. He needed to get out, to escape the nightmare that had invaded his car. He didn't dare look back again. The fear of seeing her again was too much to bear. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to get out, to run, to escape whatever was in the back seat. He knew he had to act quickly before the terror paralyzed him completely. But just as he reached for the door handle, a cold, wet hand clamped down on his shoulder. The sensation was like ice, sending a shiver down his spine and freezing him in place. He froze, the air in his lungs catching. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the sudden, chilling touch. The grip tightened, fingers digging into his flesh with unnatural strength. It felt as though the hand was trying to pull him back into the darkness. Slowly, he turned his head, his body moving against every instinct to flee. Each movement felt like an eternity, his muscles straining against the overwhelming urge to run. The woman was leaning forward now, her disfigured face inches from his. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin looked as though it had been decaying for years. Her breath smelled of decay, like something long dead, and her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but filled with malice. It was a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the grave. "Why won't you look at me?" Her words were like a dagger, piercing through the fog of his fear. Jay's heart pounded in his chest, his vision blurring as panic gripped him. He could feel his pulse in his ears, a deafening drumbeat of terror. He tried to scream, to move, but his body refused to obey. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. She leaned in closer, her face almost touching his, and her smile widened. "You'll never leave." Her words were a chilling promise, a sentence to eternal torment. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Jay flung the door open and scrambled out of the car, stumbling onto the empty road. His legs felt like jelly, barely able to support his weight. His legs shook beneath him, and his mind raced as he tried to gather his senses. The world around him seemed to spin, the darkness closing in. When he finally dared to look back at the car, it sat idly in the fog, its headlights casting eerie beams into the night. The silence was deafening, the stillness unsettling. The back seat was empty. The woman, the hand, everything was gone as if it had never been there. Jay's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. He could still feel the cold grip on his shoulder, the phantom touch lingering. Had it all been in his head? The question echoed in his mind, a desperate plea for some semblance of reality. Was it a dream, some twisted hallucination brought on by fatigue? Or was it something far more sinister, a glimpse into a world beyond his understanding? But then, as he stood frozen in the middle of the road, he heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "I'm still here." His eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, where a pale, bloodied hand pressed against the inside of the glass, and the woman's twisted face stared back at him with a final, chilling grin. Jay never drove down that road again. But no matter how far he goes, late at night, when he checks his mirror, he sometimes still sees her, waiting.